The $3,000 bill had been on the black marble table in the living room for exactly 23 minutes. And Elena Torres knew because she had counted every second, every tick of the antique clock that dominated the wall, every pulse of her own heart, beating too fast, too loud, too desperate. She cleaned around that folded green rectangle with the meticulousness of someone avoiding the inevitable, wiping the cloth over the marble in ever-shrinking circles, getting closer to that temptation that burned brighter than fire, that screamed louder than any voice. $3,000, 6 months of her salary, the difference between despair and breathing, between sinking and surviving a little longer. She knew exactly how much it was because she had calculated it mentally 3 times, because numbers were the only thing she still had control over in a life that had become a slow, inevitable collapse. The chief had left an hour ago, taking his guards with him, his silent threats, his presence making the air heavy even when he wasn't speaking. The mansion was empty except for her and that forgotten money. Forgotten. Elena didn't believe it for a second. Dante Moretti didn't forget anything. Not by accident. Not by carelessness. Men like him didn't get to where he was by being negligent. Everything was calculated, measured, tested. And that note on the table was a test. Too obvious to be accidental. Too tempting to be coincidence. He was testing her. He wanted to know if she would steal, if she was trustworthy, if she had a price like all the other people who passed through his life, leaving trails of betrayal. But what Dante Moretti didn't know, what no one knew because Elena had become an expert at being invisible, at not being seen, at existing on the margins where people looked right through you without really seeing, was that she had already failed every important test in life. She had already lost everything that mattered. She was already so deep in the hole that falling a little further wouldn't make a difference. So when her hand reached out, when her fingers touched that paper that represented temporary salvation, she wasn't thinking about consequences. She was thinking about Mateo, her son, 7 years old, leukemia, chemotherapy that cost her more than she had, that drained every penny, every hope, every second of sleep. The doctors had given her 6 months without proper treatment, had talked about expensive experimental options, had used words like maybe and if we're lucky and make up while there's still time. And Elena had translated it all into the only truth that mattered. She needed money or her son would die. And all the morals in the world weren't worth the life of a 7-year-old who still believed in superheroes and happy endings. She took the money. She folded it again, smaller, tighter, an origami of desperation that fit in the pocket of her worn apron. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was certain someone would hear it, that alarms would go off, that Dante Moretti would appear like a vengeful apparition and confront her about stealing from him, about betraying the minimal trust that existed between employer and employee. But nothing happened. The mansion remained silent. The clock continued to tick, and Elena finished cleaning the room with trembling hands, with a conscience that screamed, with the absolute certainty that she had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. 3 hours later, she was in the hospital, in the pediatric oncology ward that had become more familiar than her own home, where the walls were decorated with cheerful drawings that couldn't disguise the smell of disinfectant and slow death, where bald children played with donated toys and parents with deep-set eyes faked smiles they didn't feel. Mateo was sleeping, small and frail in the too big bed, with tubes connected to his too small body. His skin so pale that it made Elena want to scream at God or fate, or whatever force deemed it just to make children suffer. She went to the administrative desk, where the receptionist knew her by name, and the look of pity that Elena hated but had learned to accept because pride was a luxury, and she had no luxuries. "I need to make a payment," Elena said, pulling the money from her pocket. The $3,000 that burned like embers, that weighed like lead, that represented theft and salvation at the same time. The receptionist counted the bills with professional efficiency, stamped receipts, updated the system, and suddenly Mateo had 2 more months of guaranteed treatment, 2 more months of hope, 2 more months where Elena could believe that miracles existed and her son would be the exception to the statistics. She went back to the room, sat in the chair next to Mateo's bed, held his small hand that used to be chubby and was now just bones covered in thin skin, and cried silently because she had just stolen from a dangerous man to save her son, and she didn't regret it one bit, but she was terrified about what would come next, about when Dante Moretti would find out, about the price she would have to pay for choosing her son's life over her own safety. What Elena didn't know what she couldn't know as she held her son's hand and whispered promises that everything would be okay, even though it was a lie, was that Dante Moretti already knew. He had hidden cameras in every room of the mansion naturally, because paranoia kept people like him alive, because trust was weakness and weakness was death. He had watched Elena take the money, had waited for her to pocket it and disappear or spend it on something frivolous that would confirm what he already knew about human nature. But then her men followed her. They reported that she went straight to the hospital. And when Dante hacked the medical records because privacy was a concept that didn't apply to him, when he read about Mateo Torres, 7 years old, with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, a guarded prognosis, when he saw the medical bills that amounted to small fortunes and understood that Elena was drowning in debt trying to keep her son alive, something strange happened in Dante Moretti's chest, something he hadn't felt in so long he almost didn't recognize it. Guilt. He had tested her, and she had technically failed the test, had stolen from him, had proven she had a price like everyone else. But she had also passed so spectacularly, so unexpectedly. Dante didn't know what to do with this information, with this woman who stole not out of greed, but out of love, who broke the law not to enrich herself but to save, who chose to risk everything for someone more vulnerable than herself. This was heroism disguised as crime. It was sacrifice wrapped in despair. She was everything Dante's world wasn't, everything he had forgotten could exist. He sat in the dark office, watching the security cameras show Elena returning to the mansion well after midnight, entering through the back door, moving through the house with the exhaustion of someone carrying the world on her shoulders. She didn't know he was there, watching, calculating, trying to decide what to do with this maid who had just become infinitely more complicated than she should have been. Firing her would be easy, forgiving would be dangerous, but ignoring her was impossible, because something about Elena Torres and her sick son and her desperate honesty had pierced the armor. Dante had built over 20 years of violence and betrayal. Tell us in the comments below, would you have taken the money to save someone you love, or is honesty worth more than any life? Elena Torres woke up every day at 4:30 in the morning, in an apartment that smelled of mold and expired medication, in a neighborhood where sirens were the soundtrack and hope was rare. The first thing she did was check if Mateo was still breathing, because the fear of finding him cold and motionless was the nightmare that followed her even when she was awake, transforming each morning into a lottery of terror where she never knew if she would get lucky or if the universe would finally exact the price of her temporary happiness. Her son slept in the only room, surrounded by drawings he had made before the diagnosis, when his hands were still steady and his imagination still encompassed futures. Elena slept on the living room sofa, whose broken springs dug into her back, but she didn't care, because physical discomfort was irrelevant when her soul was slowly being crushed by helplessness. She worked 3 jobs. Dante Moretti's mansion from 6 in the morning to noon, cleaning rooms bigger than her entire apartment, dusting imported marble, organizing closets filled with clothes that cost more than she would earn in years, then a laundromat from 2 in the morning to 6 in the afternoon, steam and heat and strangers' clothes that she folded mechanically while her mind calculated, bills that never closed, and finally, night shifts at a supermarket 3 times a week, restocking shelves under fluorescent lights that made everyone look half dead, which was fitting because Elena felt half dead most days, functioning on autopilot. Body present but soul somewhere far away where the pain couldn't reach. Money was never enough. Mateo's medical bills were monsters that grew faster than she could feed them, interest piling on interest, debt begetting more debt, and Elena had sold everything of value, borrowed from everyone she knew, exhausted favors, patience, and any credibility she had. Her family in Mexico couldn't help because they were poorer than her, and her ex-husband had disappeared as soon as the diagnosis came. He had proven that some men are cowards when life demands courage, that fatherhood for him was a concept, not a commitment. So Elena was alone. Completely, utterly alone in this war against her son's death, in this impossible struggle where she was soldier without weapons, a general without an army, a mother with no resources except love, and love didn't pay for chemotherapy, didn't buy experimental drugs, didn't make miracles happen. Love only kept you going even when going on was agony, kept you up even when you wanted to crumble, made you steal from dangerous men because the alternative was watching your son die, and that was no alternative at all. She had started working for Dante Moretti 6 months ago, through an agency that provided Discreet employees for clients who valued privacy over references, who asked about loyalty but not about past, who paid cash and expected absolute silence. Elena didn't know who Dante Moretti was initially, didn't recognize the name that made others lower their voices and look over their shoulders. She only knew that the pay was better than her other options, that the mansion was beautiful in ways that made her shabby apartment seem even shabbier, and that the boss was rarely there during the days so she could clean in peace without having to perform gratitude or subservience. But over the months, she began piecing together the pieces. The men in dark suits who always accompanied Dante, the conversations in Italian that abruptly stopped when she entered the room, the guns she occasionally saw left on tables, treated with the casualness of someone so accustomed to violence that weapons become accessories, not threats, the newspapers that sometimes sat on the coffee table carrying headlines about organized crime, disputed territory, someone important who had disappeared, and everyone knew who was responsible, but no one had the courage to say it out loud. Elena understood she was working for a criminal. She should have been terrified, should have quit, should have put distance between herself and this dangerous man. But she needed the money too desperately to afford the luxury of moral principles, and Dante had always been polite to her in a distant manner. Never threatening, never inappropriate, just distant, as if she were furniture that happened to move and clean things. She was invisible to him, and invisibility was security in his world. Except now she was no longer invisible. She had stolen from him, had failed her test, had become a problem, or a curiosity, or something that demanded attention. And attention in Dante Moretti's world was dangerous. It was the kind of thing that made people disappear. It was the spotlight no one wanted, especially if you were an illegal single mother with a sick child and no legal or social protection. That morning, after collecting the money, Elena arrived at the mansion with a sinking stomach, expecting to find Dante waiting for her with accusations or worse, expecting this to be her last day of work and possibly her last day of freedom. But the mansion was as empty as ever, as silent as ever, with no sign of change. She cleaned mechanically, each room a torture of anticipation, every sound making her heart race, every shadow looming large. She was finishing her library when she heard footsteps. Dante Moretti entered the room, and Elena felt her entire body lock up, going into fight-or-flight mode, except she could do neither, so she just stood there, clutching her duster like it was a weapon or a shield or something equally useless. Dante studied her for a long moment, his face revealing nothing, his dark eyes unreadable, and Elena thought, this is the moment. This is where he confronts me, where everything falls apart. But all Dante said was, I need you to stay late today. I have company arriving at 7, and they'll need dinner served. Can I count on you? His voice was neutral, professional, as if nothing had happened, as if $3,000 hadn't disappeared from his desk. Elena blinked, confused, then nodded because what else could she do? Of course, Mr. Moretti. I'll be here. Great, Dante said, and walked out of the library, leaving Elena alone with her confusion and relief and the growing feeling that something was happening she didn't understand. Some game being played with rules no one had explained. Dante Moretti learned at 12 that trust was a fatal luxury. When his father was murdered by his best friend over $10,000 in territory in a neighborhood that wasn't worth broken loyalty, when his mother was forced into prostitution to pay debts that weren't hers, when Dante understood that the world was a place where people sold each other for shockingly low prices and survival meant never trusting anyone completely. He built his empire by constantly testing loyalties, strategically allowing temptations, creating situations where people revealed their true colors, eliminating those who failed before they could betray him in ways that truly mattered. The $3,000 was a test he ran with each new employee, purposely forgotten money, enough to tempt but not so absurd that it seemed like an obvious trap. Some took the money and disappeared, confirming their risk. Others handed it over, performing an honesty that may or may not have been genuine. And some, like Elena, took it but not for themselves, revealing a moral complexity Dante didn't often encounter in his world, where ethics were a flexible concept and survival justified almost everything. He should have fired her. Technically, she had stolen, broken trust, and failed the test. But Dante couldn't stop thinking about Mateo Torres, 7 years old, leukemia, his chances of survival improving with each treatment Elena could afford. He had hacked all the medical records, knew every detail of the child's condition, knew that without continued intervention, Matteo would die within months, knew that Elena was literally working herself to death trying to keep her son alive. And something about this stirred Dante in ways he hadn't expected, hadn't wanted, that were inconvenient and dangerous, because feelings were vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities were exploitable. He had spent 20 years eliminating his own humanity, transforming himself into an efficient machine that made decisions based on logic, not emotion, that saw people as assets or risks, not as human beings with stories and pain and desperate reasons to make bad choices. But Elena and her son had pierced that armor. They reminded Dante of his own mother, of how she had sacrificed herself for him, of how love could make people do impossible, illegal, morally ambiguous, yet fundamentally human things. He saw his mother in Elena every time he watched her on camera, saw the exhaustion, saw the fierce determination, saw the love that refused to give up even when giving up would have been easier. So Dante made his decision. He wasn't going to fire her. He wasn't going to confront her. He was going to observe. He was going to learn more about this woman who had become unexpectedly fascinating. He was going to discover if she was a genuine exception or just another person performing kindness while hiding selfishness underneath. He wanted to be wrong about human nature. He wanted Elena to prove that good people existed, that sacrifice without expectation of reward was possible, that the world wasn't completely corrupt. But he was also pragmatic. He placed discreet surveillance on Elena, not only to protect her but to confirm that she wasn't playing some deeper game, wasn't using her sick son as a cover story for something more sinister. In Dante's world, paranoia kept you alive, and he hadn't gotten to where he was by being naive about human motivations. The following weeks confirmed what Dante half expected, half feared. Elena was exactly what she seemed, a desperate mother doing everything she could to save her son. She didn't spend a penny of the stolen money on herself, didn't tell anyone, didn't try to steal again despite multiple opportunities. She just kept working her 3 jobs, visiting Matteo whenever she could, existing in this state of permanent exhaustion that made Dante feel something uncomfortably close to admiration. And the more he observed, the more he wanted to truly know her, not through cameras and reports, but through conversations, through understanding who this woman was who defied all his cynical expectations. He began to be present at the mansion more often during her hours, began making small talk that she responded to politely, but with the appropriate distance between a maid and an employer, began leaving. Things for her to find, not tests, but disguised gifts. Extra money accidentally included in her pay, a pantry full of expensive food she could take home. Elena accepted the kindnesses silently, without comment, without question, and Dante didn't know if she realized he knew. If she understood that the test had evolved into something more complicated, a dance where they both pretended nothing had changed when everything was changing. He was drawn to her, not just physically, though she was. Beautiful in quiet ways he appreciated, but intellectually, emotionally drawn to her strength, her resilience, her refusal to break even under weight that would crush weaker people. But attraction was a problem. In Dante's world, relationships were targets, vulnerabilities exploited by enemies, luxuries that cost too much. He saw powerful men fall because they loved the wrong people, because they let feelings dictate decisions, because they forgot that love in the underworld was a death sentence, waiting to be executed. So Dante tried to keep his distance, tried to see Elena as an employee, not a woman, tried to stifle feelings before they grew. But then Matteo got worse. Dante learned before Elena that Matteo had been admitted in critical condition, that the leukemia was progressing faster than treatment could control, that doctors were talking about experimental options that cost a fortune and guaranteed nothing except more time, perhaps, if they were lucky, if the universe would decide to be merciful for once. His informants at the hospital reported that Elena had broken down in the waiting room, that she had begged the doctors for any solution, that she had offered her own life in exchange for her son's, as if bargaining with fate were possible, as if maternal sacrifice could cure leukemia. Dante made a decision without fully thinking, which was unusual for him, and which indicated that Elena had invaded his judgment in dangerous ways. He called the best oncologists in the country, offered absurd sums to consult on Matteo's case, pulled favors from people who owed him money, mobilized resources he normally reserved for protecting his empire, not for saving a 7-year-old child he'd never met. And then he went to the hospital himself, something his security guards hated because hospitals were public spaces full of vulnerabilities. But Dante didn't care because he needed to see Elena. He needed to offer help. He needed to do something about this urgency in his Just that wouldn't go away. He found her in the pediatric ICU hallway, sitting on the floor because all the chairs were occupied. Her scrubs still dirty because she'd come straight from the laundry room as soon as the hospital called. Her face streaked with tears she no longer even tried to hide because dignity was a luxury. And she had no luxuries, only fear and love and despair so deep it was almost palpable. Dante sat on the floor beside her, and Elena didn't even notice at first, so lost in her own grief that the rest of the world had disappeared. "Elena," Dante said softly, touching her shoulder. She jumped, looking at him in confusion because why would her boss be here at the hospital? Why would he know about Matteo? Why did anything make sense? "Mr. Moretti," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I know I should have told you I wouldn't be working today, but my son, he's not okay, and I couldn't just go and clean him when he could be." She couldn't finish her sentence, just broke down again. Silent tears streaming because crying loudly wasn't allowed here where other families were also suffering. "I know about Matteo," Dante said. "I know about the leukemia, about the treatments, about how hard you're fighting. And Elena, I need you to listen to me now. I will pay for the treatments, all of them. The experimental ones, the best doctors, everything he needs. You won't lose your son for lack of money." Elena stood completely, still processing the words, trying to understand if she'd heard correctly. "Why," she finally asked, "why would you do this? You don't even know me, you don't even know him. Why would a man like you care about people like us?" Dante should have given a pragmatic answer. Should have talked about employee loyalty or investment in human capital or any rational justification that maintained emotional distance. But looking at Elena's face, at the naked pain and absolute vulnerability, he couldn't lie. "Because you took $3,000 from me and didn't spend it on yourself," he said. "Because you're a better mother than most people are human beings. Because watching you destroy yourself trying to save your son is killing me in ways I don't understand and don't want to examine too closely. And because I can help, so I will. Simple as that." "It's not simple," Elena whispered. "Men like you don't do things without expecting something in return. So what do you want from me? What's the price?" Dante felt like he'd been punched, felt the accusation fair but painful because she was right. People in his world always demanded prices, always had agendas, except he wanted nothing more from her than that. More than what? He didn't even know. "I want you to let me do this," he said finally. "I want you to accept help without questioning your motives. I want your son to live, Elena. That's the price. Let me save him." Elena studied his face for a long time, searching for lies, searching for traps, searching for the hidden cost that experience had taught her always existed. But all she saw was sincerity, genuine and frightening, coming from a man who supposedly had no capacity for kindness. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, I accept your help. But Mr. Moretti, if this is some kind of game, if you're using my son to control or manipulate me or anything, I swear I will find a way to destroy you even if it costs me everything. Mothers protect their children. Always. No exceptions." "No," Dante said, and there was respect in his voice. "That's why I'm doing this. Because you remind me that love is action, not feeling. That sacrifice is real currency in a world of lies. You remind me of who my mother was, and I owe it to her, wherever she is, to do something good in her name. So let this be. Let your son live. Let you stop killing yourself. Let me be human for once in my miserable life." And then Dante Moretti, head of a criminal empire, a man who had killed people with his own hands, did something that shocked even himself. He pulled Elena into his arms, held her as she finally cried for real, loud sobs she had been holding back, and he realized he was crying too. Silent tears for the mother he had lost, for the humanity he had buried, for the child he would never know but would save because saving Matteo was a way of saving the part of himself he thought was dead. Matteo survived the crisis. The new treatments worked better than expected, and within weeks he was in remission. A medical miracle bought with Dante's money, but achieved with the resilience of a child's body that refused to give up. Elena returned to work at the mansion, but everything had changed between her and Dante. There was intimacy now that hadn't existed before. There was a mutual awareness of vulnerabilities. There was gratitude and guilt, and something more complicated that neither of them wanted to name because naming it would make it real, and real would make it dangerous. Dante began to eat dinner at home more often, always at times when Elena was there, always asking her to join him because eating alone was depressing and he was tired of always being alone. Elena refused at first, keeping her distance, but Dante was persistent and gentle in ways that disarmed her defenses, and eventually she began to sit with him. Conversations beginning about Matteo and evolving into more personal, intimate topics, revelations about pasts and fears and dreams they had both buried beneath survival. She learned that Dante hadn't chosen to be a criminal, that circumstances had forced him, that he was slowly trying to transition into legitimate business, but legacy and loyalties made exiting difficult. He learned that Elena had been a teacher in Mexico, that she loved literature and poetry, that she had sacrificed career and country and everything she loved to give her son a better life, even if that better life meant cleaning strangers' houses. They discovered they had more in common than they should have. Two people from impossible to reconcile worlds finding an unexpected connection, but connection brought danger. Dante's enemies, always watching for weaknesses, noticed that he was spending time with a maid, that he had paid for absurdly expensive medical treatments for her son, that he looked at her with a softness no one had seen in him in years. Weakness was opportunity in his world. And Elena Torres was walking weakness. The first threat came as a message, a photo of Matteo leaving school with a rifle scope superimposed over it. A simple message, she matters to you, so she's a problem for us. Dante immediately doubled security, placing guards at Matteo's school. At Elena's apartment, following her wherever she went, Elena noticed the surveillance and was terrified not for her own safety, but because she was putting Matteo at risk, because her friendship with Dante, or whatever it was between them, was painting targets on innocent people. "I need to stop working for you," Elena said one night, her voice firm despite tears in her eyes. "This isn't safe for me, for Matteo. People are watching us, they're making threats, and I can't risk my son after everything we've been through to save him." "You're not safe away from me either," Dante replied, frustration and fear mingling in his voice. "They already know about you. Leaving now won't erase that. At least here I can protect you. I can make sure nothing happens. What if your protection isn't enough?" Elena challenged. "What if they're better, faster, more desperate than you? What if I lose my son because I was stupid enough to accept help from a dangerous man?" "Then I'll die protecting you," Dante said simply. "Because Elena, you need to understand something. I fell in love with you. I didn't plan it, I didn't want it, but it happened. And I can't just let you go knowing you're in danger. I can't pretend you don't matter when you've become the most important person in my miserable life." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with implications. Elena looked at Dante, saw truth in his eyes, saw love that shouldn't exist between people from different worlds, saw an impossible future they both wanted but couldn't have. "I can't love you," she said, but her voice trembled, revealing the lie. "I can't put Matteo at risk because of my feelings. I can't be selfish like that." "It's not selfishness," Dante said. "It's living. It's choosing happiness despite danger. It's believing that something good can come out of all this darkness." Before Elena could respond, an explosion rocked the mansion, glass shattering, alarms going off, guards screaming. Dante instantly drew his gun, shoving Elena behind him, moving toward the threat because that was what he did, facing danger head-on. But Elena grabbed his arm, panic in her eyes. "Matteo," she whispered. "If they're attacking here, they might be coming for him. Dante, please, we need to get to him." They raced to the armored car, Dante driving like crazy through the city streets while talking on the phone, ordering his men to converge on Matteo's school and protect the child at all costs. Elena prayed silently, bargaining with God or the universe or whatever force was listening, promising anything in exchange for her son's safety. They arrived at the school to find chaos, police everywhere, desperate parents, and Elena in absolute terror until she saw Matteo being carried away by one of Dante's guards, frightened but unharmed. She ran, scooped her son up in her arms, held him as if she would never let go. And over his shoulder she saw Dante watching with relief, and something else, something that felt like a decision being made. That night, after Matteo was safe, after the threat had temporarily passed, Dante made a proposal. "Leave the city with me," he said. "Leave this life behind. I have resources, connections. I can give us new beginnings in a place where no one knows my past. We can be family, Elena, you, me, Matteo. We can have a normal, safe life where the only danger is boredom." Elena should have said no immediately, should have shielded Matteo from the complications of loving a man with a blood-stained past, should have chosen security over the possibility of happiness. But looking at Dante, seeing vulnerable hope in his eyes, seeing a man who had transformed himself for her and her son, seeing the chance for a different life where Matteo would grow up with a loving father figure, she's found herself saying, maybe, saying, I need to think about it, saying, I don't know if I can, but I want to try. The following days were a nightmare of decisions. Elena researched compulsively, discovering more about Dante's empire, about the terrible things he had done, about the blood on his hands that he would never completely wash away. She read newspaper articles about unsolved crimes linked to him, about people who disappeared after crossing him, about the systemic violence he orchestrated even as he tried to transition to legitimacy. Each discovery was a stab at the fantasy she was constructing, reminding her that fairy tales with monsters never end well. But then she saw Dante with Matteo, saw how gentle he was with children, how he taught Matteo to play chess with infinite patience, how he read bedtime stories in funny voices that made the boy laugh, how he held Matteo's small hand when he was scared, and Elena saw that people were not monoliths, not completely good, or bad but complicated, containing multitudes, capable of tenderness and violence simultaneously depending on context and choices. Dante was struggling too. His advisors begged him not to abandon the empire he had built, warning him that stepping down from his position of power would make him a target, that enemies would come for him the moment he appeared weak. He would have to leave behind loyalties, connections he had nurtured for decades, the identity he had built. It was professional. Suicide? And possibly literal. But when he weighed it against a life with Elena and Matteo, against the possibility of being a father and partner instead of a boss and a criminal, the choice seemed obvious, even if terrifying. The decision was forced when a new threat emerged, not against Elena or Matteo, but against Dante himself. Rival had learned of his plans to leave, interpreted it as weakness, and moved to seize territory. War was coming, inevitable and bloody, and Dante had to choose, stay, and fight, protect the empire, but put Elena and Matteo in constant danger. Or leave now, cut losses, accept that some battles aren't worth winning. Elena found him in his office late one night, surrounded by maps and reports and the weight of impossible decisions. She sat beside him silently, waiting until he looked at her, exhaustion etched in every line of his face. I've decided, she said simply. I'm going with you. Matteo and I will go wherever you go. We'll start over. We'll try this. No, we have between us. But Dante, you need to promise something. You need to promise that violence is behind us, that the man you were won't come with us, that we can have a clean future even if the past is dirty. I promise, Dante said, and he meant it. Wanted to believe it could be different, but they both knew promises were fragile, and pasts had ways of catching up with futures. But a promise was all they had, so they clung to it, plotted their escape, prepared new documents, new identities, a new life in a small country where Dante's money would buy anonymity and time to heal. 3 days before the planned departure, everything fell apart. Rival moved faster than expected, attacking not Dante's properties, but people, kidnapping 2 of his most loyal men, sending severed fingers as a message. It was a declaration of war that could not be ignored, a final test of who Dante truly was, a man fleeing for love, or a leader fighting for loyalty. Dante was paralyzed for the first time in decades, torn between 2 mutually exclusive futures. If he stayed and fought, he would save his men, but lose Elena, who would never accept living with constant violence. If he left, he would live with the guilt of abandoning people who trusted him, and his enemies would use this as proof of weakness and hunt him forever. Elena saw his agony, saw the man being torn in half, and made a decision for him in the most Elena way possible. She went to the rival herself without guards. Without weapons, just a determined mother making an impossible bargain. She offered everything Dante had planned to give her: money, resources, connections, in exchange for letting Dante go in peace, in exchange for the war ending before it began. It was a sacrifice she shouldn't have had to make, a heroism no one would see, a love proving stronger than fear. The rival, surprisingly, accepted. Not out of kindness, but out of pragmatism, because war with Dante would be costly, because letting him go with dignity could prevent future retaliation, because Elena had offered a fair price for peace. But there was a condition. Dante could never return, could never claim territory. He had to disappear completely and permanently. When Dante discovered what Elena had done, When he realized she had bargained for his freedom at the cost of everything he had planned to give her, he felt something simultaneously break and mend in his chest. She had saved him from himself, had chosen his life over her. Comfort had proven that love wasn't about grand gestures, but about silent sacrifices that no one applauded. They left town a week later, 3 people in a modest car heading toward the border and an uncertain future. Dante was no longer a boss, no longer powerful, no longer feared. He was just a man trying to be good to the woman and child who had given him reason to be better. Elena no longer had the stability his money had promised, but she had something more valuable, a partner who had proven that change was possible, that love was action, not words. And Matteo, healthy and happy in the back seat, knew nothing of trials or sacrifices or prices paid. He only knew that his mother was truly smiling for the first time he could remember, and that the man beside her looked at them both as if they were the entire universe. And that was all that mattered to the 7-year-old who had survived leukemia and deserved family, real and imperfect and struggling, but family nonetheless. The end? No, because stories like this don't end cleanly. They don't have clear resolutions. They don't offer guarantees. They simply ask, what would you sacrifice for love? What would you risk for a second chance? What is a new life worth when the past never truly dies? Elena and Dante had no answers, only choices. Only a fragile hope that $3,000 stolen from a desk had been the beginning of something impossible becoming possible, of a test with no right answer revealing that the best answer was love proven through action, not declaration. And as they drove toward the unknown, neither of them looked back, because looking back meant seeing everything they'd left behind, everything it cost, everything they'd lost to gain each other. Looking forward meant possibility. And possibility, as frightening as it was a gift they'd both forgotten to desire until they found it.